The old world is dying. The new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Antonio Gramsci. Well, not exactly, but who cares? Hi, I'm Francis Fukuyama. It's great to live at the end of history here in 1989. No major social changes are ever going to happen again. The Soviet bloc's gonna fall, China's going capitalist, soon everyone will live under a liberal democracy, and they'll have nothing to fight about anymore. Just kidding. It was me all along. But I've got bad news for Francis. Liberalism is dying. The age of liberal democracy is wrapping up. But there's good news too. There's opportunities. We should try to understand the disintegration of liberalism to take advantage of those opportunities to create the conditions for liberation. I'm Chris, and welcome back to the channel that's about to coin the term endarkenment. In 1989, while working for the Rand Corporation, Francis Fukuyama wrote an article based on a speech about the end of history called The End of History. Then he wrote a book based on the article based on the speech called The End of History and the Last Man. Samuel Huntington wrote an article in response to Fukuyama, also with a question mark, and then also wrote a book based on his article, also more confidently removing the question mark. Benjamin Barber also wrote an article in response to Fukuyama and then a book based on the article, but he was already pretty sure, so he never used a question mark. In the original article, which presciently came out just before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet bloc, Fukuyama said something bigger was going on than just the transition of Eastern Europe to democracy. The 20th century, despite setbacks here and there, had seen the triumph of liberalism, first over absolute monarchies, then fascism, then Bolshevism. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of humankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The state that emerges at the end of history is liberal insofar as it recognizes and protects through a system of law man's universal right to freedom, and democratic insofar as it exists only with the consent of the governed. The end of history means the end of the war of ideas. Fukuyama was declaring victory on behalf of liberalism. Fukuyama was regularly forced to revise his thesis as the world changed, but if this article from 2022 is any measure, he still thinks liberal democracy will win out in the end. Russia and China were the vanguard of a broader authoritarian wave that turned back democratic gains across the globe, from Myanmar to Tunisia to Hungary to El Salvador. Sorry, Russia and China? This wave is part of a global far-right power grab, a lot of it emanating from the US. Now the US is poised to become a far-right hegemon, with more power to spread this model of government, whatever you want to call it, around the world. But they'll lose, says Fukuyama, because authoritarian states make poor decisions with disastrous consequences. Because liberal democracies don't do unpopular things like that. Then Fukuyama basically calls me Xi Jinping when he says supporters of liberal democracy must not give in to a fatalism that tacitly accepts the Russian-Chinese line that such democracies are in inevitable decline. Well, I'm arguing they're in decline, and we're past the point of no return. It was always likely, if not inevitable, that liberalism would eventually become authoritarianism because liberalism did nothing to stop the rich constantly getting richer. The more wealth controlled by the wealthy, the less everyone else has. If you have no wealth and no property, like most people, the system does not work for you. And the starker the differences in wealth, the more brutal the police are. I figured all this out, and you might have too, without consulting with the Russian-Chinese spies that tell me what to say. Finally, Fukuyama says he's still right, that there's no preferable alternative to liberalism, because he doesn't know what we know. I'll address that point later. Political economic ideas become the system not because the people want it, but because the ruling class generally thinks the idea will best facilitate the use of its power. The consent of the governed is impossible to obtain, so rulers don't bother asking. Feudalism gave way to capitalism in Britain when the new capitalist class gradually took over the reins of power from the older aristocracy. Eventually, no one with any influence wanted to go back to feudalism. How could they? It would mean turning back time, putting the genie back in the bottle. Not only did British liberals make Britain liberal, they disseminated the liberal model around the world. As one of the most important global powers, Britain was to a great extent a leader among states, the way the US is today. The most powerful state in the international system, the hegemon, wants to exercise power without restraints like strange laws and different values, so it sets out to remake the world in its own image. So when World War I wrapped up and imperial subjects around the world wanted what was being called self-determination, they mostly followed the liberal democratic model. For a while. My last video was about how Trump or Elon or anyone can't just do it all on their own, that they have millions of people doing their work for them. In this video, when I say Trump or Elon is doing something, it might not be them so much as some people working for them. I'm arguing Trump and Elon and Project 2025 and their people have killed off liberalism. But maybe it wasn't such a great system to begin with? What was liberalism? Well, I could cite dozens of old dead liberal philosophers and try to distill a definition, but Wikipedia's already done that. So we could just go there. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent to the governed, political equality, the right to private property, and equality before the law. In my videos, I try to convey that words for complicated ideas tend to have more than one definition. There might be Americans diving for the comments to say that's not what liberalism is, but this is what the word means philosophically, internationally, historically. Many American conservatives might be surprised to learn that they too are liberals. Liberals generally support private property, market economies, individual rights, liberal democracy, secularism, the rule of law, economic and political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Modern liberals recognize the importance of related values such as pluralism, toleration, autonomy, bodily integrity, and consent. Liberalism is frequently cited as the dominant ideology of modern history. At the center of it all is the state. The state is supposed to implement all these great things. The problem is the state works primarily for the powerful. Always has. That means the commitment to the rule of law, freedom, and rights is honored more in theory than in practice. It depends what the people with influence over the process allow. Sometimes you can get a court to force the government to do what the laws and constitutions say it's supposed to do, if you can afford it, but the rest of the time you still live under the rule of capital. Liberal democracy has proven it can't provide homes for everyone, can't feed all of the hungry, can't take care of all the physically and mentally ill people, can't eliminate racism and nationalism, because all these problems are inherent to liberalism in practice. The state enforces property rights, not human rights. Again, on paper, we might have dozens of rights, but, well, ask a homeless person what their rights to a home, food, and medicine have done for them lately. In practice, people have the right to vote, unless they're young, foreign, or felons. People who can afford lawyers have the right to a fair trial, and human rights are the carrot on the end of a stick we believe we're the ones holding. That's the thing about liberalism. Its myths of rights and freedoms for all is used to cover the intentions of people who use power. They promise to do what we assume is their job and do what we want them to do. But they don't do what we want. They don't even ask. It took me a long time to drop my faith in liberalism because, like Fukuyama said, it promised the end of a time of major ideological conflict. If it actually did what it said it did. Instead, using tools as wide-ranging as interstate conferences and cruise missiles, the liberal states rapidly imposed their model on the rest of the world. Wealth had been pretty concentrated before, but globalization over the 80s and 90s sent it through the roof. The system might have been spreading the nominally democratic model of competitive elections, but it didn't solve anyone's problems. The US-led invasion of Iraq made half-hearted attempts to install a democracy, but was so tainted by its intentions to privatize Iraq's resources that the country unsurprisingly remained in chaos after the occupiers left. Liberalism created the conditions for all this to happen. There's nothing about elections that guarantees people you hate won't take power. In fact, they guarantee the opposite, that people you hate eventually will take power because the way is open for them. The tools of power are there for anyone to use. Liberalism plants the seeds of its own destruction. If you've ever watched or read anything about the history of neoliberalism, you might be familiar with the idea of hegemony already. You would have heard about how some intellectuals got together to make stuff up about how capitalism meant free markets, how free markets led to free people, and how privatization and deregulation would lift all boats. They said it over and over and over, making everyone else say it, and soon it just became part of the conventional wisdom. They mostly just wrote books and started think tanks, but their influence permeated the culture. Once they had the ear of power, their policies spread throughout the world. They found champions in Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. When Ron and Mag took office, they implemented the innovations being proposed and persuaded or pressured other states to do the same. As a result, the gap between rich and poor is wider than it's ever been. They didn't realize neoliberalism would be the final stage of capitalism. Fukuyama didn't really acknowledge in his essay how capitalism works and how it changes everything. Capitalism isn't stable but prone to crises and revolutions, and it provokes backlash. So why wouldn't things change? There are regular economic crises and crashes, throwing ever more people into poverty and concentrating wealth in fewer hands. But just the day-to-day workings of capitalism screw everybody over too. Everything becomes property, owned for profit, so you can only access it if you can afford to. It's not just land, it's everything, from food and shelter to information. Insulin was once free. Its inventors intended it to be free. One liberal century later, it's so expensive people have to decide whether to buy insulin or food. Widespread poverty, resentment, and desperation are inevitable under such conditions. The money wins and the people lose unless we unite and fight back. So why would liberal democracy be the ultimate model for society, Francis? What's so great about it? It doesn't really enforce your rights unless you can afford it. It's not exactly robust if any party can just come along and let the richest man in the world do what he wants to it. The people don't have the power if it's so easy to ignore them. If all liberal democracy can do is say, wait until the next election and cross your fingers, it's cooked. So I consider nearly all the stated values of liberalism empty promises, but they were the empty promises that characterized liberalism. Given the huge gap between promises and results, I'm not entirely sad to see it go. The problem is what's replacing it looks like a nightmare. The system that's emerging is not even trying to look like it cares about liberal values or rights. At least when the state pretended to care about laws and rights, there was a chance of challenging one part of it in court. Now the government acts without regard to court orders. This wiki article on liberalism makes a distinction between social liberals, people who like the welfare state and anti-racism, and classical liberals, who believe in less state intervention into the market. So even a lot of conservatives are liberals in the sense that they believe in the liberal system. But the people who've taken over the federal government are not. They are, let's say, the traditional right. In a liberal democracy, governments are under pressure to appear to be following the law and applying it evenly, to appear to be working for the people. This government isn't even pretending. Its stated aims are to punish, threaten, sue, and silence. It was elected by a movement that believes in punishing people for being something other than white, cis-het, and male. It campaigned on a platform to that effect. It's doing what it promised. If the Democratic Party had responded by A, blocking Trump Gov 2 at every turn rather than just spinelessly acquiescing to everything, and B, moving to the left and standing up for trans people, migrants, disabled people instead of considering them acceptable sacrifices, then there might have been some chance for liberalism's survival. There could have been a revitalized Democratic Party to take down Trump in 4 years. But Democrats have presented little to no opposition to Trump's terrible people and policies. Remember when Trump promised you wouldn't have to vote again? Do you think Trump will let anyone who presents more than the most token resistance to his policies get elected again? But then, how would that be different from now? But it's not just that Elon or Trump can make it harder for Democrats to get elected. They're making it difficult for any liberal policies to get passed again. Most immediately relevant is a clique chosen by Elon Musk, who, let's remember, was not elected or even appointed, has been going around Washington making changes with no transparency, no oversight, and no mandate from anyone but Trump himself. Do I need to mention this is illegal and unconstitutional? Because it hasn't stopped them. In fact, it hasn't stopped the police from helping them. Under whose authority? That's not super clear. But it's good to know none of these questions matter anymore. So what are they doing? They're entering whichever state agencies they feel like and doing whatever Elon wants. They're ravaging agencies people rely on to survive, like USAID. They've shuttered departments that have investigated Tesla, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They're trying to get access to all the classified information they want, including everyone's data. Of course, that's one problem with states having all your data in the first place. They're erasing government records and websites. They're rewriting history to exclude Black and Indigenous people. They're cutting staff at Social Security, possibly in an effort to kill off the poor and disabled, the National Institute for Health, because health is no longer something the government does, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because why would anyone need to know about the weather? Doge even broke into and shut down the United States Institute of Peace, which is not a government agency, and the police helped them. It looks like they're replacing the people and records with large language models, because tech bros like Elon get the contracts. So when you want answers or justice, you'll get them from a robot. But I'll admit letting AI make decisions can't be much worse than letting right-wingers make them. It won't be that different. If the likes of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are the ones programming these things, the robots will work for their interests. But Elon's Nazi nerd patrol is not the only force in Washington. Trump promised to make ICE his personal Gestapo, and he's followed through. They've been calling everyone they want to a criminal and a terrorist and a gang member and a threat to national security to make up a reason to deport them. They're using ICE to silence the pro-Palestine movement. Being against genocide makes you a terrorist. You might have heard of Mahmoud Khalil, but he's not the only one. They claim to have revoked at least 300 student visas, which suddenly puts those students in the country illegally, so they can be deported. A proudly pro-genocide Zionist organization called Betar gave their names to the government and then bragged about it. The government is taking revenge requests. Maybe that's why they targeted 238 Venezuelans living in the US, who've been sent to a giant prison plantation in El Salvador. For what crime exactly? Well, Karen White woman reported them for being scary brown men. That's the only thing we know they're guilty of. They haven't had trials. They never will. If anyone tells you they were gangbangers or the other ones were Hamas supporters, you know they're just repeating the government line, presumably because they approve of what the government's doing. Always keen to justify ethnic cleansing, Fox News hosts actually said no one should get a trial. Hey, if the president says they're bad, then obviously imprison and enslave them for the rest of their lives. You might be aware a judge ordered the White House to stop deporting people, to give it 14 days, and the White House responded with no. It has generally been ignoring court orders and laws and the Constitution, including the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendments. If anyone who took those oaths to uphold the Constitution wants to stop them, now is a time. But they won't do that because those oaths were always just empty rituals you went through to get a job. And they'd rather keep those jobs than do what's right. So ICE imprisonment and deportation and possible trafficking is one way to silence people. It's not the only way. Police officers detained Momodou Tall to silence him so he couldn't appear in court to sue Donald Trump. Trump has already sued several media outlets for publishing unflattering stories, some of which have settled out of court, meaning they're likely to avoid doing anything that might make the president mad in future. Trump is also silencing and intimidating lawyers who sue him or just displease him. It's government by revenge. The probable gutting of Social Security and Medicaid will cause all kinds of problems for people, but probably even more deadly is the choice to make an anti-vaxxer the head of public health. Vaccines are probably the single most effective way ever devised by science to save lives. This guy is planning to reverse that. Thanks to grifters like RFK, the deadly but preventable measles is making a comeback. This post-science mode of government is a further repudiation of liberal values. The new FBI has chosen to reduce its focus on domestic terrorism because domestic terrorists are the Republican Party's base. How much do you want to bet it'll spend less time investigating child trafficking and CSAM for the same reasons? Its priority now is to stop terrorism against parked cars. the real victim in all this. DC police are actually using the term hate crime to describe defacing Teslas.
Well, I hated it.
Trump and Elon are trying to influence politics around the world and are threatening war with anyone who has some strategic asset they want so they can dominate the world and push out Russia and China. This alone does not mark the end of liberalism, as George W. Bush's public pronouncements amounted to the same, except he didn't really threaten white people, just brown people. Each presidency has chipped away at the safeguards democracy provides. Bush passed and used the Patriot Act, for example, and cut a little bit off liberalism's flank. He invaded a few countries without UN Security Council approval, and the global liberal order was shown to be ineffective in stopping him. Because Bush had successfully skirted the Constitution, older legal doctrines like habeas corpus, and the pretense that the law was ever evenly applied, no future White House would ever be constrained by those things either. I've tried to convey in past videos that despite its constitutions and its competitive elections, liberalism has always been vulnerable to this kind of assault. When members of the ruling class want to change, they fund think tanks and media outlets and political parties to make that change. It turns out the ones who won the most recent battle of ideas are ready to turn off democracy's life support. Most liberal conservative arguments are now moot. Why even bother arguing about how much the state should intervene into the market when the state is being reoriented to personally serve the richest guy in the world? Elon will leave soon enough, but his stamp is indelible. Norms, practices, and entire agencies have been eliminated. They were made in different times, when the rulers of the time thought they would benefit from the existence of things like Social Security and international law. It's clear the new tech oligarchy has no use for such things. If liberals and conservatives really don't want to bring on a new dark age, they might consider working together to bring these guys down. But whatever they accomplish, the system we were brought up to believe in is gone. It would take decades to build back the institutions that have been lost, the institutions that characterized the era of liberalism. Today's ruling class doesn't seem to want them back. For years, they've been tolerating and encouraging the rise of the right wing, not just as a political phenomenon, but a cultural one. Electorates have been moving right for a while now. This new generation of right-wingers loves violence so much the government turns deportations into content for them to beat it to. Liberals won't even be able to contest the vote anymore. Since most of the people with all the money seem to be lining up behind this government and movement, they're not likely to fund any Democrats who aren't pretty right-wing themselves. You can see it already, as prominent Democrats keep telling readers of the New York Times and the Atlantic to stop caring about trans people because it might lose them the next election, or to throw some other group under the bus, so that even if the Democrats do win, they'll just be another right-wing party. The candidates and parties who will receive most of the funding will be so far right, the ministries and departments they build will not be for helping people. We can't even be sure the US will ever see another legitimate election. The prospects of returning to the good old days when the only pressure on white liberals to follow politics was to get Seth Meyers jokes are looking slim. But why does this new right-wing government in the US mean liberalism worldwide is ending? The US has long been a hegemon, by which I mean both a leader and a dominator at the same time. It kind of threatens and forces people and states, but it also plays a major role in spreading its ideology to them. The US did the most to pressure the rest of the world to adopt liberal democracy. The Trump government is spreading something, but it's not liberal or democratic. Over the past 2 decades, or maybe longer, the really right wing has been building support for its policies around the world. In the US, it finally found a way to enact them in the 2016 Trump campaign. Now Trump's back, he's more authoritarian than ever. They're propagating this right-wing, authoritarian, populist, trying hard not to say fascist, but model across the globe. They've got think tanks, conferences, political parties, and the support of the wealthiest man in the world. Party strategists in various countries are aware of this shift and are moving with it to chase the money. They all want $100 million donors too. They don't want to get sued into the ground. It was bad enough when Peter Thiel sued Gawker for doing journalism, but now guys like him have full access to the Justice Department along with the FBI, the CIA, whatever. They're all being remade to suit the richest, right-wingiest people. So if liberalism's fading into history, what's the world transitioning to? Illiberal democracy? Disciplinary neoliberalism? Competitive authoritarianism? Inverted totalitarianism? Techno-feudo-fascism? Rule by chatbot? Who knows? But we have some influence on the future. I don't mean over the state. Most of us don't influence the state. I mean in our own lives. Their numbers and capacity are limited, and when enough people rise up with the right approach, they can beat any state. Measures like calling you a terrorist for making Teslas go pop is a sign of fear, because resistance is effective. You're hitting them where it hurts. And the US isn't the only place where things are going down. As Vicky Osterweil says, millions are in the streets in Turkey, Indonesia, and Serbia. Another global wave of struggle is crashing. We face far-right regimes as capital has no other answer to last decade's movements. We're in the middle of an era of revolution, war, and collapse. Anything and everything is possible. Education needs to be a part of this movement we're building. There's support for resistance, even assassination right now, because the regime crossed a line and everyone can feel it. We can capitalize on people's anger by explaining how these issues are a product of the concentration of power and wealth, of using patriarchy and white supremacy to divide and conquer us. It should be clear now there's no salvaging the rule of law, for example, as Trump's people are above the law, and if they succeed, no one in government after them will face any judicial restraints. But we can still have rules. We can still have governance without government. We just have to work together. We make decisions as equals in organizations, in communities, across communities, with solidarity as our guiding principle. Want some stuff to read? Check out the description of this video. Democracy as we know it is slipping away, but democracy as it's never been could be right around the corner. Mutual aid is an integral part of any movement. Mutual aid means taking care of each other as equals, providing for one another however we can, and defending each other against authoritarians and white supremacists who want to hurt and oppress people. Countless people around the world will suffer as a result of these policies we're seeing implemented. With enough people organized around a goal, we can build a movement that provides for everyone, where the state and the market just take. Another thing I try to emphasize in my videos is this is also happening. There's always resistance and mutual aid taking place. You just have to look for it and get involved. Fukuyama claimed only 3 years ago, echoing Margaret Thatcher, that there was still no viable alternative to liberalism. It's become a cliche with its own acronym. TINA, there is no alternative. Don't even bother trying different forms of governance or economic organization. It'll just be a violent waste of time before you come back to liberalism. I think there are millions of people in the world working and living communally who have proven him wrong in that regard. I also think we'll need to learn to share and work together again if we want to survive the 21st century. So as this system fails, we'll find opportunities to unite more people and organize for a better future than existing systems could ever provide. That's the good news. History is back. They've renewed it for another season. This will be our history.